now. I'm very happy to welcome a hero of this ecosystem, the man who's running Careem. We've heard a lot about Careem so far today. I'm very happy to welcome Mudassir Sheikha himself, and he's going to introduce his next session. Mudassir.
فيك القلب معلومة حبيب القلب شعلومة.
Assalamu alaikum. How's everyone doing? Great. So first of all, thanks a lot to Danny, Amir, and the Beko team for putting up this amazing event. A lot of familiar faces. And thanks to Chris for putting you all to sleep or on your smartphones. So we'll try to wake you guys up a little bit. But before we do that, let me welcome Rob Coneybeer to come and join us on the stage. Rob, as some of you might know, is a partner at Shasta Ventures. He's been a VC for 22 years, sits on 10 boards, and I don't know how he takes time to manage all of them. But his investment interests are in emerging technology, space, connected homes, and augmented/virtual reality. And an interesting fact about Rob that many of you might not know is that he actually spent some of his early years growing up in Saudi Arabia. So he's been in the region for some time. Welcome, Rob.
Which chairs are we going to take?
I think we can decide, no? So Rob, the topic is how do we manage boards in the best possible way? You sit on many boards. What does a good board look like?
Well, a lot of it depends on the company, depends a lot on the entrepreneur. And before we get started, one question I'd like to ask is, how many people in this room are founders, have actually founded a company? So it looks like about half. So just to check to make sure everybody's raising their hand, how many people are not founders? Raise your hands. Okay, so a little over half are founders here. And how many people that are founders have a board right now? Smaller number. And keep your hands up if you enjoy your board meetings. So it's a pretty small group of people.
Right.
I notice you're not raising your hand.
Not on the last one, but maybe yes, I have a board.
Yeah, no, I mean, what makes a good board, and a lot of the way that I think about a board is, to be fair, in the context of what I see in the United States, is it's an engaged board that is putting the interests of the company first. That's what they're very focused on. And it tends to be a good dynamic where the board members are well-informed, they understand the company, and they are more minority investors as opposed to control investors, which means that they're there to support and help the company be successful. So that's what makes for an effective board. Now, a lot of it depends on the stage of the company, what the board members actually focus on doing. So in the early days of a company, you might not have a compensation committee, you might not have an audit committee, and you're really focused on how do you get the core pieces into the company and help out, and you have those board meetings very frequently. You might have them once a month. As a company becomes more mature, such as the stage that you're at right now, a quarterly board meeting makes a lot more sense.
Right. And the board is supposed to, let's say, do all of these things, support you, understand the business. How do you get the board members to do the things that you want them to do versus them telling you what you should be doing?
Well, a lot of it comes down to a few things. One is being prepared for the board meeting and how you set up the structure of getting ready for the board meeting. So, for example, what kind of materials do you put together for the board meeting? Do you put together exhaustive materials? Do you put together tight materials? Is it something that you put together at the last minute? Do you actually get it out to the board members a couple days in advance, or do you get it out the morning of, or they show up at the board meeting? So if you want the board members to be helpful, you want to have them receive a package and have materials so that they can go through and they can review it and they can think, what are the questions that they have about the business? And in looking at that, they can start to think about, hey, is the company having trouble with marketing? Is there an opportunity there? Or does the management team have the right people in place? Those are the types of things that you want your board to be prepared for when they actually show up in the boardroom.
So as, let's say, a board member, and to all the founders in the room that have board members as well, what's an ideal experience that you want to have as a board member that would give us a template or a format that we can start learning from?
Yeah, I'd say the number one thing is transparency. But by transparency, I mean not like, here's everything that's going on, because in the US, the orientation of a venture investor is around a minority investment, not a control investor. So what that means is understanding the fundamentals of a business so that we can be helpful. And we spend a lot of time on what I think of almost as business development activities. So introductions that we could make to channel partners, introductions to people that could be executives that you could hire into the company, those types of things. But to do that, you have to be properly informed in what the business is doing.
Right.
So what that means is it's better to share bad news earlier than later. And it's also good if you're sharing bad news, and I'm sure you've never had bad news for your investors, share the bad news in a way that it shows that you've started to think through how to solve it. So it's not just the bad news, but it's, okay, we got a flat tire, and you say, well, we're planning to call roadside assistance, we're going to do it this way, or we're here and we're going to actually change the tire ourselves. It might not be the best analogy, but you want to provide answers as well as the problem. And this kind of comes back to a fundamental dynamic that can be somewhat concerning for founders, which is when you think about the roles and responsibility of a board, it's to provide oversight, it's to approve financings, it's to approve share issuances, so whether it's an option pool associated with a financing. And then the other one, which people are very painfully aware of, is do you fire the CEO? Or do you support the CEO? And the role of a board is to support the CEO until it's not time to support the CEO anymore.
Right.
So it's this interesting dynamic because you want to put the best, as a founding CEO, you want to put the best foot forward because you want to keep your job. But at the same time, to keep your job, the company needs to be successful. And the best way to do that is to really harness your board and really be able to get them to help you in terms of introductions to the next round of financing and the other things that we were talking about.
So let's hold off on the firing point because I have a question for you on the other side.
Yeah.
But just mechanically, what timing of sending decks, of how to run board meetings have worked well for you so that we can all learn from?
So I tend not to talk as much about what works for me because every board that I work with, the entrepreneur has a different style of what works for them. So I work to share what I view as best practices, but it can be different depending on stage, et cetera. Now, going to the companies that have been the most successful, I can talk about what I've seen. And what I've seen as a best practice is get the board deck out 2 days in advance.
Okay.
Further in advance, things change in the company because things change so fast in startups. And you get it too close, you don't have time to review the materials, spend a couple hours with them, reflect on them, take a few notes, and be prepared for the meeting. Because if you send it out even just a day in advance, you might have hit that board member at a point where they have an incredibly busy day and they can't review it. So you want them to show up so that when you have 3 hours of their time, how long is a typical Careem board meeting?
We've had a 10-hour one.
Wow.
And we've had normal ones, which are 3 to 4 hours.
Okay, so typical one being 3 to 4 hours. You want to make the most of that 3 hours. So if you're making the most of your board member, you want to pull more than 3 or 4 hours out of them. So the way to do that is to give them some homework in advance. And in the best companies that I've been involved with, they actually put together fairly comprehensive materials. And then they use the materials as a way to hold their management team accountable for where are we right now with marketing? Where are we right now with operations? Where are we right now with these different things that we need to do with partnerships and building the business? Where are we with our sales pipeline?
Yeah. So one thing that we evolved into, as an early stage startup, there were always more important things to do than to prepare for the board meeting. So the board decks would typically be ready just a minute before the board meeting. But then what we realized is we were actually spending a lot of time going through things that the board could have gone through earlier on their own with the right time to digest and ask the questions. So we have evolved into a similar structure, send the deck out at least 24 hours prior. And then in the first half, don't even go through the business performance because they can actually go through it and you can just ask them to ask questions that they might have. But really, really spend the time on discussing things that might require a dialogue, that might require alignment, that might require a decision. And that's been the best use of time with people in the room versus walking them through, this was the growth rate this month,
right.
This is why it was there. You can all read that stuff, and it's in the board deck.
Yeah, that's right. And often I see boards start with the first slide is highlights and lowlights, and you talk about the things that have gone well, and then you talk about the things that you're working on and the concerns you have up front to set the tone for the meeting.
Right. So we'll come to how do we select a board, but since you brought up the firing a CEO point, how do you fire our board member?
That depends. It's a good question. That depends a lot on where you are. And we were talking about this a little bit before we came on stage today. A lot of it depends on game theory. And by game theory, what I mean is, do you have board members that care a lot about their reputation for the next investment they're going to make and the next investment they're going to make after that? So my ability to get into the companies as an investor in a competitive environment like Silicon Valley depends a lot on what the CEOs and the founders have to say about me from the prior companies. So that doesn't mean that they're always happy with me, but what it does mean is things like, was I engaged? Was I thoughtful? Was I helpful? Did they trust me? So every CEO that I work with, they know where they stand with myself and with Shasta, so we don't always have great news or a positive perspective all the time. But at the same time, we're always thinking about how can we help the company move forward. So the way that happens in terms of a board member being fired, et cetera, is, and I'm talking about a little bit of inside baseball here, is sometimes, let's say you have a firm of 10 partners. Some of those partners are doing better than others in that firm. And that partner doesn't necessarily want you to be sharing with the other partners that they're not a good board member. So it's a dangerous game. So I'm not saying that's advice that I would have for founders, but in more mature economies, people really want to put their best foot forward as a board member. And over the 22 years that I've been investing in venture capital, I've seen a dramatic change in terms of people being more thoughtful about what is a reputation going to be for subsequent investments.
Right. And
and one final thing I would say is, let's say you have a company and it has 4 board members that are investors on, say, a 7-person board. When you raise another round of financing, what you can do as a founder is you can tell that new investor, I agree with you. I think that our board is a bit big. And then that new investor will actually write into it XYZ number of investors. And that's one of the ways, that's one of the forcing functions you'll see for change in board composition.
Right. And I think just reflecting on this a little bit, and Michael's comment as well in the last panel, it is, once things get into the shareholders agreement, it's very, very difficult to go back on them. And once people get on the board, it's very, very difficult to get them out. And when you're raising additional capital from new investors, that's probably the only time it's relatively easy to get someone out. And also depends on where they sit on the cap table. But in ordinary course, it seems fairly challenging.
Yeah, and I think, again, some of it depends on a couple things. One is, I would imagine somebody that's a board member of Careem, they don't want to leave the board because it's kind of working out. It's on a good trajectory, so people want to have that affiliation. If the company isn't working out as well, then people are like, are you sure you need 5 investors on your board?
Right, that makes sense. And going back to the beginning of this relationship, selecting a board. Now, in many cases here in the region, as an entrepreneur, you don't have a lot of choice. And as Careem's journey began, Series A, there was only one term sheet on the table. Series B, one term sheet on the table. Then you start getting some more choice. In this environment, how can you select who comes and joins the board? And maybe you can also share with us how board selection happens in the US in a more mature environment.
Yeah, so I think here, you have that meeting, they want to invest, nobody else can invest, you've just met your new board member. That's kind of the dynamic. And then you may think more about the terms and the other pieces that come in. That's one. And then two, one of the things you can do is you have somebody that wants to come in, you can always expand the board. And it's difficult, but you can look at having another seat. You can look at bringing in another outside investor. So one of the things that I always encourage companies to do is to be actively on the lookout for a great independent board member. And that's a way to dilute some of the issues that you could have with a new investor coming in that candidly you're not that excited about, but the money is, as they say in the US, green.
Right. And how many people in the room have an independent board member?
Should probably be a bigger number. I mean, when I think about the companies that I've been involved with, like an independent member who you have somebody who has served on boards, taken companies public, et cetera, can be a great resource to talk to. They have less conflicts of interest.
Right.
So it's easier for them. And also, if it's somebody that's experienced that you bring on, like we're investors in a company called Eero. And I introduced the company to Jack Lazar, who was on the board of a company of Atheros that built Wi-Fi chipsets you guys have probably never heard of. But they're on a board of another company I'm sure you've heard of called GoPro. And he was the CFO that took GoPro public. So he really understands operations, he understands board management, he understands all the different pieces of putting financials together. So he has been a fantastic resource to Nick Weaver, the CEO. And at the same time, because he has this relationship with Nick, he can kind of moderate stuff a little bit with the rest of the board and really be an advocate for Nick, or it's easier for him sometimes to say, Nick, these are the things that, you are areas for improvement.
Right. I think just, reinforcing this point around independent board members, we got an independent board member, I think, in the second year of the business. And we got really lucky that this independent board member was actually able to spend a lot of time with the business. And in almost every fundraising round, there were some points that were a bit tricky. And he was able to work with all the other board members, investors, to get agreement on them. So, if you can find the right person, it's definitely worthwhile an investment. And I think as things grow, it also reduces the legal risk to the board in some shape or form, right?
Yeah, it definitely helps. And I think as you grow the board, growing the number of independents is a good idea because it brings a balance to the board. So on one hand, having investors as board members is great because they're aligned. They want to make money. They want the company to become more valuable. But then sometimes those interests can get out of alignment, and independent board members are able to really help moderate and mediate different points of view.
A practical question on independent board members. How do you compensate independent board members?
Stock. Okay, no, I know where you're going. It's pretty much anywhere from 0.5% to maybe 1% or 2%, and it really depends on what they're bringing to the company. And the other thing that we typically see is it's on anywhere from a 2 to 4 year vest. So you need to have that continued service and engagement for them to earn the shares. And the justification is if you're going to be up at the upper range, you ask yourself, are they making the company 2% more valuable or more? You'd hope 10, 20, 30% more.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And Rob, one question, and there is maybe a cultural context here as well. Relationships, this region is quite, a lot of things happen through relationships, and it's a bigger part of business in this region than it may be in other places. How important is it to build relationships between the founders and the board members and among the board members themselves? And what are some of the better ways that you've seen how it is done?
Yeah, so I think, and I'll talk about the US, typically in early stage companies in the US, the board members get to know the senior management as well. They know the founders, there's a line of communication there, and that naturally happens. And the thing that board members need to do is they need to be very careful when they talk to, say, your management and not you, that they are not creating issues where somebody says, well, Rob said we should do this, or they start to do something as opposed to working to act as a resource to them and maybe a sounding board, but they leave the decision making to the CEO because the role ultimately for the board is to support the CEO. As far as cultivating those relationships, what I've found works really well is a dinner, a board dinner the night before, where you get together, it's a more relaxed setting, and that's one. And then two is you can encourage your board members to go and sit down with somebody. So one of the things that I've had happen with Turo, so we're investors in Turo, it's the world's largest, fastest growing peer-to-peer car rental marketplace. So think of it as Airbnb for cars. And the company is at serious scale now, but in the early days when we had some product challenges and things we were working on, Andre Haddad, the CEO, would ask me, hey, can you go take Tom out to breakfast and talk to him about it? Like, what do you see as best practices at your other companies? So as CEO or as a founder, you can actually encourage that and create homework for your board members.
Right, right.
Creating homework is actually something that the better companies do.
And what are good ways of doing it?
So some of that might be you have a round of financing coming up and you get introductions.
Right.
And you get the introductions, and then in the board meeting, you go through, and this might not be the right phrase, but you're kind of shaming the ones that haven't done anything. So you set up a competitive dynamic between, I can see Danny smiling. It sounds like he's either shamed or been shamed before. You set up that competitive dynamic. And that's one of the benefits. Like, on one hand, you can look at having a number of board members who are investors on your board is, okay, wow, is there balance or not? But the flip side is, if they are relatively equal in ownership, you can set up a bit of a competitive dynamic between them,
right,
which is healthy.
Right, right. Got it. And I don't know if other people in the room have run into this as well, but we don't have a lot of operators in the VC ecosystem. A lot of the money comes from people that have not been, let's say, early stage VCs, or comes from maybe private equity or large financing backgrounds. How would you say we should manage different profiles on the board?
That's a good question. I've been thinking about that a lot over the last couple of days with some of the people in the room. I've been meeting people in the local ecosystem, and I hear about this challenge, exactly what you're talking about, because you have people that have a private equity mindset where you buy a company and you tell the CEO what to do, as opposed to influence minority investors who come in and buy 10 to 20, maybe 25% of the company. All they want are protective provisions. They don't want control. And the mindset is very different. So to a certain extent, there's education, but it's also just going and saying, here's what I need you to help me with. And to be able to think about what are the specific things. So if you know that somebody is connected to a strategic partner you'd like, or somebody could be a channel partner, or somebody that's well connected to help you build out your team, you enlist them and you say, hey, I'd like you to interview and screen a bunch of candidates. And what you might find is if you get them involved in the screening process and then they're not engaged, it's a lot easier to hire that person and say, well, hey, you had every opportunity to interview these people and you didn't. Right. We know because we put the time in. It's that type of thing where you create a bit of work to get them engaged.
Right, right. And I think in this region, especially, so there is a whole PE versus, let's say, a VC mindset. And I've had personally discussions with some board members saying that the way that you're governing us is not working. You need to become more supporting versus more telling. But at the same time, one thing that might be slightly different here is some of the people that come and sit on the board, they are extremely well connected in different ecosystems, different markets, different functions. And the value they can add is tremendous, right? So for example, some of our investors, they are investors in many other large companies in the region as well. So that one phone call doesn't just lead to an introduction, it leads to a deal in some cases. Because the power of the
And it sounds valuable.
It's super valuable.
It's very
So
valuable.
you can put that to work in the right way, then this can create a ton of value.
I think the way that you would address it is you would seek balance in the board. So one way to look at it is say, I need to have a small board no matter what. And when you want to have a small board no matter what, but every new investor needs a board seat, then it's likely that you're going to end up with a bunch of investors on your board. And if you come from a region where they're all private equity focused, you're probably going to have a private equity heavy board. So it actually points out that it's probably more important to actively recruit people who have been at other successful startups and they've seen these challenges and bring them onto the board. So I've got to believe it's a lot easier to say, when you're looking at a term sheet, this would be advice, you say, hey, this term sheet's great. We'd love to have you on the board, and let's have an independent come in. So that's one way that you could really bring balance to it and do that. And then it becomes a question of who approves the independent and how does that happen, et cetera. Because typically what you'll see in the US is if you have, say, a 5-person board, 2 investors, 2 common, representing the company, that independent seat might stay empty for a while, but then it gets approved by all 4 people either saying yes or no to who that would be. What you don't want to have is have people that are obstructionist where they agree to do it, but nobody's ever good enough for that independent seat.
Right. What would it take for someone like you to serve on some regional boards?
That would be challenging. I'd say more time, less boards that I'm on right now. But it is an interesting thought. Finding the really pragmatic, practical thing that I think people could do is to hire people onto or recruit people onto the board who are active in other companies right now. And they don't even need to have had outcomes, but they could be some of the leading companies that you all know out here.
But generally, let's say if there is an independent seat and you would like to get someone from outside the ecosystem to come and join, what is the value proposition? What's the pitch? How could we make it
Oh, to
interesting
that
for them?
person?
To that person.
Well, they're interested in a couple of things. One is if they're going to get 1 or 2% of Careem, that's
Equity is
there's
interesting, yeah.
that's the money talks. That's one way of looking at it. But at the end of the day, people do it as independents because they want to give back in some manner, or they're really fascinated by the business and they like the entrepreneurs and they want to get engaged. So when I mentioned Jack Lazar involved with Eero, it was largely because he liked the business, he was fascinated by the business, he wanted to do it. Bill Campbell, before he died, this is a guy who was, it sounds like you're familiar with Bill Campbell. Bill Campbell was known as coach, like he's a very, very famous outside board member. He got involved with Nest and joined the board there because he loved the mission of the company. So to a certain extent, you need to find an independent that can help, that's had experience in scaling. It could be somebody that's a personal friend. It could be any number of things. But you do want them to bring some sort of truly independent perspective. And it could be in the ecosystem. I've got to believe at the stage that you're at, even though it's still early, that there are plenty of operators that you could bring in that are operating businesses here, but they're not owners.
Yeah, I think less so on the tech side, but yes.
Well, they don't have to
Otherwise,
be tech people.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, everything's a technology business now. So it could be somebody that, if it's somebody that's used to hiring and firing people, selling products to customers for more than they paid to make them, you know, kind of all those things of building a successful business. And I'm sure you guys know the family businesses in the area, the ones that actually make money and the ones that don't. And you get ones where they're more self-made and more recent. I've got to believe in those businesses you have people that might not own a lot and they have a lot of current comp, but they're not in the family to own it. There have got to be operators in there and executives that you'd want to hire on and bring into the board. Now, Problem is, you'd have to convince, the heavy hitters that you have from the financial community on your board to do that. But I think there's a real opportunity there, and I think it also enlightened VCs love having independents come in because it can really help shoulder the load.
And maybe, Danny, this is something that the ecosystem can work on, right? To identify these people who can serve as independent on these different boards. Could be a big value add to the ecosystem. But, I've been asking enough questions, and some of this is, of course, painted by the journey at Careem. We'd love to open it up for questions that people might have on anything related to boards or otherwise for Rob.
Thanks, guys. Quick question, Rob. How much do you think, you sit on 10 boards, so you're quite busy. How much do you think of managing the board is part of your job as a board member versus you leave it to the CEO, and if the board is messy, and let it be?
Yeah, it's something that we do think about. I'd say, number one, it's kind of unspoken in the question, but you were asking me about this ahead of time. How do you handle 10 boards? Part of what you do is it's almost like a portfolio. There are some companies that need a lot of help at that time, and there are other companies where everything's on track, and your best value add is to let them continue growing without a lot of input. So coming back to this question of managing the board, having been at it for a while, sometimes I'm in a board meeting with somebody that's a new board member, and we took the money. I won't say which companies, but sometimes you take the money because that's the term sheet you have. You pull them aside after the board meeting, and you talk to them, and you say, look, that was really counterproductive, what you did. Sometimes you need to do that on behalf of the company. And it's something that is probably best done without involving the CEO, or you can get body language signals from the team. You can just see when something's disruptive in a board meeting. Or what you can do is speak up in the board meeting when something's going on because somebody just keeps asking questions on product, and you say, hey, let's take this offline. Or why don't we get to it later? And that is part of the responsibility of a board member, is to be cognizant of what's going on in the room and being able to help the team and the CEO that's running the board meeting run the board meeting, and somebody else not to sidetrack it.
Maybe just two, it's a great question, and two maybe things that have worked for us. One is, as Rob said, the independent board member is quite valuable because that person has less agenda driven by an investment gain and can actually be your ally in helping manage the others. And the second thing that we haven't done, but I actually feel that sometimes that might be helpful, is making someone the chairman of the board that you get along with, that you feel that can be the person that can help manage the others. Because there is sometimes a thing that if no one is, there's not a single accountable person, then no one sort of does it, right? So if you make someone the chairman, and that sort of very explicitly becomes their mandate to help you manage the rest of the board, might be helpful as well. There's a question in the back.
Thanks. So just a specific question. We're at the seed stage, board member, it's a three-seat board. 2 are co-founders and our lead investor. So would you suggest we have a separate board of advisors that are very strategic value add? Do we lump the two together, or do we keep them separate?
Well, I mean, very quickly, at the earliest stages of a company, I would keep the board, the formal board itself, as small as you can until you get a little further along, because you'll have the natural expansion of the board size that happens. And there are so many, we didn't talk about the responsibilities, but a lot of people are better suited to being in a board of advisors role because you have the different duties. It's the duty of loyalty, duty of care that we were talking a bit about before. That's where you have to put all shareholders consider all the shareholders when you're making decisions as a fiduciary. And then you also have to make sure you don't have conflicts of interest. So the last thing you'd want to have is to have somebody that is an advisor, and it's great to have them as an advisor. But then if you're only getting like 2 hours of their time a month, do you want them to be spending that 2 hours helping you with very strategic issues? Or do you want them to be spending those 2 hours deciding like, how do you allocate stock options and some of the other questions? So I think what you can do very pragmatically is you can cultivate people and then you'll find out which of the board of advisors is the most valuable and stays engaged, and you would want to have on the board for a long time. And one final comment I would say is that pretty much boards tend to get bigger. They rarely get smaller until there's some really strong forcing function. So bringing somebody on the board is a really big deal.
Yeah. Resist the temptation as much as possible. It only gets bigger. There's a question here.
So I'll just share a quick experience. I mean, I've done a lot of boards on both sides. And I was involved with, let's say, a fairly difficult board where we decided to bring in 2 independents to try to kind of help the balance a little bit. But to my disappointment, the 2 independents that we brought on board, excellent, seasoned, very experienced and everything, but always deferred to the investor board members. They always felt that they should have the bigger say. How do you get around that issue?
That's a good question.
Yeah, when I see that type of thing, if you have a lot of people kind of heading one direction, there's probably, they may be right. Now, I don't know anything about your circumstance, so it's hard to say that with certainty, but there might be something there why they're doing that. It may mean that you picked the wrong independents. I mean, if you pick an independent, I can tell you Jack Lazar on the Eero board or Bill Campbell on the Nest board, those guys, they had points of view and they'd occasionally defer to the investors, but these are both folks that were truly seasoned and they weren't going to defer. And if they did defer, it was for good reason. So what I would say is it comes back to the selection that you have of those independents as opposed to how do you manage them after the fact. And one question I would have is, did you actually talk to them and ask them, hey, it seems like you're always deferring to them. Why is that? Yeah, okay. But it is the type of thing, and again, I may be naive in bringing a Silicon Valley perspective to it, but people tend to be pretty direct with this sort of thing and having those conversations, not in the larger board meeting, but offline, going and having one-to-one conversations like that, people will do all the time outside of the board meeting.
Just one thing that I think most of us don't do it or don't get the chance to do it, but if we can, at the earlier stages, interview a board member for alignment of some sort on values and expectations, that can be quite helpful. So, at Careem, we've tried to build a culture that is quite values-driven, and there are certain values and missions that we subscribe to. I don't remember any board member that came on board that I sat down with and said, look, orientation on Careem, these are the values, this is the purpose, this is what we're doing, and this is why we're doing it. We do this with all our colleagues, all our leaders, but somehow one of the most important stakeholders in the business we don't do enough of, which I think is a big learning from the last 6 years of Careem. We should have spent more time interviewing them, orienting them, and constantly reminding them of the values and the culture of the business. Because then they are more aligned in many places than they would be otherwise.
Yeah, and then you have the discussion afterwards, and maybe the independent is having a point of view of something. You say, well, didn't we all agree on these values? So how is what you're saying consistent with those values that we all agreed to?
Thank you. Gives you an ammunition. Someone is having some board issues, maybe.
I mean, if nobody's going to ask questions, I'll keep asking. Thank you guys for being here. Question to you, Mudassir, actually. We all know what happens, the pre-board meeting that happens outside, and then having board members that come with they've already discussed, colluded, and agreed on a specific subject, and it becomes extremely difficult to get them on board and have a healthy debate or a discussion in the board meeting. How do you manage that, and if it happens to you? And Rob, if you see that, how would you manage that?
So it's not happened very often, and it's absolutely not happened for the first 5 years. And generally the thing is, if things are going well, I think the board members, at least the ones that we have had, they could care less. But when you start getting into more strategic decisions or when things are not going so well, Then they, of course, start coming together. How can we support the business? How can we take a slightly different direction than the business might be going in? So that's generally the context in which it happens. And I think once people come up with a point of view in the board meeting, in some ways, it's too late already, right? So I think it's probably important for us and you to figure out how can we have these discussions earlier to make sure that we check the pulse where people seem to be standing on some of these issues, if the context is a little challenging, and then make sure that we anticipate and we align behind that point of view in some shape or form.
Yeah, I think one of the things that starts to happen, if that starts to happen, is you're heading towards that zone of should that person be the right CEO of the company? Because it comes back to the board's role is to support the CEO until they think that a change is required. And in the few cases that I've been involved with where a change has been necessary in the CEO, I've noticed that the board starts to kind of push and push and push and push. But the real question is either we're going to support the CEO or we're not. And I find that as a board member, when I ask the other board members, like, is this person the right person or not? It tends to diffuse them from kind of pushing their point of view on the CEO. Now, the thing that happens over time is if it turns out that they're right, then there's stronger back pressure, for a change or things can escalate a bit. But more often than not, when people are like pushing and second guessing, they actually shouldn't be. They just have the wrong orientation in the way they're thinking about it. And they just need to remember that they're there to support the CEO until things are, if things need changed.
Right. Great. So, guys.
One more question. Sorry, guys.
Okay. I mean, you're allowed, since you're sponsoring the event. Thank you.
So when you negotiate board matters and board decisions, what advice would you give founders in terms of how to structure those type of decisions when you're negotiating?
We look straight at each other. That's great. I would say with a lot of them,
on board, you serve on 10.
Anything that's significant, you should have a series of one-on-one discussions in advance with all of the stakeholders. And the last thing you want to do is pop surprises on people where you're in a board meeting and you're getting approval for something that's maybe a major strategic initiative or a hire, et cetera. You need to know exactly where everybody stands before you get into that. So it means a lot of one-on-one time with the different stakeholders. And it could be as simple as a conversation. Yes, I'm supportive. It's a really short phone call. It could be longer. And it could be enlisting the support of some of your board members and saying, hey, Amir, I'm glad you're really supportive of this. I agree. So-and-so is having trouble seeing this. Could you spend some time talking this through with them? And eliciting support that way. It's like any productive political process.
Right. Great. Thank you very much, Rob.
Sorry, I have one question. They gave me the mic, so you have to give. I'm over here. Yeah.
Oh, there it is, of course.
I just have a question. I'm not a founder, but I mean, we deal with founders, and one of the things that sometimes we face is that, this is none of the board's business. This board member is asking too many questions. This is why do we need to tell them these kind of things? And then, from your perspective, and because we have founders in the room, what kind of information, when is it, when a board member is just trying to ask too many questions, and what is sort of the minimum type of information that you should always provide your board members so that they don't get onto your back?
Let me take a stab this time. So I think, look, it is quite important for the board to understand the business well, and that understanding requires a certain level of transparency, and that will start from financials, key KPIs, maybe some introductions to the management team so they understand who's running the business. So some of that information sharing and transparency is actually helping them see the same things that you're seeing so that you guys are arriving at the same conclusions and decisions together. So that part is helpful. Now, if you feel that the board members or the board is starting to micromanage and getting too involved in things, then it may be worth a feedback session with the board to understand what's driving that concern, and maybe there are some root causes that you could potentially address head on and put things back to a place where it makes sustainable sense for the business.
Yeah, I think that's well articulated.
Great. Final
All
words,
right.
any?
None. Good luck, guys.
Thank you.